Sometimes the hardest phone call of your life comes from someone who no longer has the right to call you. The late afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter Global Holdings, turning the polished conference table into a sheet of gold while 12 executives waited for Nathan Carter to approve the biggest acquisition in company history. At 42, he had built an empire that business magazines admired and competitors feared. Every number on the screen made perfect sense to him. Every risk could be calculated. Every outcome could be predicted. That was how he survived. That was how he convinced himself the divorce had been the right decision 6 months earlier. His assistant, Olivia Bennett, quietly opened the boardroom door without knocking. She never interrupted meetings unless something truly mattered. Her normally steady expression had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty. Nathan noticed it immediately. "Excuse me, everyone," she said softly. "Sir, Mercy General Hospital is on the line. They say it's urgent." Nathan frowned. "Tell them I'm in a meeting." Olivia hesitated. "They insisted I tell you this first." The room grew strangely quiet. "Your ex-wife listed you as the baby's father." No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. Nathan slowly looked up from the financial reports in front of him. "Repeat that." Olivia swallowed. "The hospital says your ex-wife, Emily Brooks, gave birth this afternoon. They said she specifically listed you as the baby's father." His pulse stumbled. 6 months. Exactly 6 months since the divorce decree had been signed. 6 months since they had walked out of the courthouse through different doors without looking back. 6 months since he convinced himself closing that chapter would finally bring peace. "There has to be a mistake," he said quietly, though the confidence in his own voice had already begun to crack. Olivia simply handed him the phone. "They refused to discuss anything else with me." Nathan stepped away from the conference table. Every executive watched him disappear toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. He pressed the phone to his ear. "This is Nathan Carter." A calm woman's voice answered. "Mr. Carter, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Mercy General Hospital. Thank you for taking the call. My assistant said my ex-wife listed me as the father of her baby." A brief silence followed. "Yes, sir." Nathan closed his eyes. "We've been divorced for 6 months. I understand." "Then you understand why that makes no sense." "I understand why you're surprised." Her voice remained gentle, professional, almost painfully patient. "Ms. Brooks arrived earlier today with severe pregnancy complications. She delivered prematurely. Before she lost consciousness, she repeatedly instructed our staff to contact only one person." Nathan's fingers tightened around the phone. "Me?" "Yes." The skyline beyond the glass blurred as his thoughts raced faster than he could control them. Emily had never asked him for anything after the divorce. Not money, not favors, not explanations. Their lawyers handled everything. She disappeared from his life as completely as if she had moved to another country. "Is she?" He stopped before finishing the question. Dr. Mitchell answered anyway. "She's receiving excellent care. Right now our immediate concern is both mother and baby." Nathan stared at his own reflection in the glass. He barely recognized the man staring back. Expensive tailored suit, silver watch, controlled expression. A billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. Yet one sentence from a hospital had undone every certainty he had built around himself. "Sir," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "there's something else you need to know." Nathan forced himself to speak. "Go ahead. Your ex-wife was barely conscious when she arrived. She kept repeating your name, even after medication, even after losing strength. She never asked for anyone else." He felt something shift inside him, something he had buried beneath quarterly reports, investor meetings, and endless workdays. He remembered Emily laughing in their first apartment when neither of them could afford decent furniture. He remembered promising they would always choose each other before choosing success. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped keeping that promise. "How's the baby?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Dr. Mitchell paused for only a heartbeat. "Small. Fighting hard. Our neonatal team is doing everything they can." Nathan looked back toward the boardroom where a billion-dollar acquisition still waited for his signature. For the first time in years, those numbers looked strangely meaningless. "Mr. Carter," the doctor continued, "we can't force you to come, but I believe you'll regret it if you don't." Nathan lowered the phone slowly. Behind him, the executives remained frozen, watching through the glass as the most disciplined businessman they had ever known stood perfectly still, unable to make the one decision no spreadsheet could calculate. The drive across Chicago felt longer than Nathan Carter could ever remember. The city that usually symbolized ambition now blurred beyond the windshield in streaks of gray and amber as evening rain softened the skyline. His driver glanced at him once through the rearview mirror, but wisely remained silent. Nathan had canceled the acquisition meeting with a single sentence, something that had never happened in 15 years. Investors could wait. Board members could complain. None of it mattered anymore. Every mile toward Mercy General Hospital raised another question that logic could not answer. Emily had always been honest, sometimes painfully so. She had never manipulated people, never played games, never used emotions as leverage. If she had spoken his name while drifting in and out of consciousness, there had to be a reason. Yet the timeline refused to settle in his mind. 6 months since the divorce. 6 months of complete silence. 6 months during which he buried himself in work because it hurt less than remembering the woman who once believed he could be more than a successful businessman. The black sedan stopped beneath the glowing emergency entrance. Rain tapped gently against the roof before Nathan stepped outside. The cool air carried the familiar scent of wet pavement mixed with antiseptic drifting through the sliding hospital doors. Inside, the bright white lights erased every shadow. Nurses hurried past with quiet purpose, while distant monitors created a steady rhythm that seemed to echo through every hallway. Success, wealth, and reputation meant nothing here. Everyone who entered these doors was simply hoping someone they loved would be all right. A receptionist looked up from her desk. Recognition crossed her face almost instantly. Nathan Carter appeared on magazine covers often enough that introductions were unnecessary. Still, there was no admiration in her expression tonight, only compassion. "Mr. Carter? Dr. Sarah Mitchell asked us to bring you upstairs immediately." He nodded without speaking. The elevator climbed slowly toward the maternity floor. Nathan watched the illuminated numbers change one by one, each floor feeling heavier than the last. He remembered another elevator years earlier, the day he and Emily had celebrated moving into their first apartment. They had laughed because the building was old and the elevator rattled with every trip. Emily had squeezed his hand and said that as long as they were together, every place would feel like home. The memory disappeared as the elevator doors opened. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood waiting outside. She appeared to be in her early 40s, dressed in navy blue scrubs with tired but kind eyes that suggested she had spent countless nights comforting frightened families. She offered a gentle handshake. "Thank you for coming." Nathan looked beyond her toward the quiet hallway. "Where is Emily?" The doctor's expression softened. "She is stable, but she is still unconscious. We are monitoring her closely." He released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "And the baby?" Dr. Mitchell motioned for him to follow. "The baby is receiving specialized care in our neonatal intensive care unit. He arrived several weeks earlier than expected, but he is stronger than we first believed." They walked past rooms where new parents quietly celebrated fresh beginnings. Soft lullabies drifted from small speakers. Family members smiled through happy tears. Nathan felt strangely out of place among them, as though he had wandered into someone else's future. They stopped outside a pair of glass doors marked Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. Before entering, Dr. Mitchell turned toward him. "There is something important you should understand." Nathan met her eyes. "Go on." When Emily arrived, she carried only a small overnight bag, her identification, and one folded envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Nathan's heartbeat quickened. What did it say? The doctor hesitated before answering. It simply read, "If anything happens to me, please call Nathan. He deserves to know the truth." Nathan stared at her, unable to respond. The words settled over him more heavily than any accusation ever could. She had trusted him with the truth after everything that had happened between them. Dr. Mitchell gently opened the secured door. "Come with me." Together they stepped into the softly lit nursery where tiny incubators lined the room beneath warm lights. Machines hummed quietly instead of loudly, creating an atmosphere of careful hope rather than fear. Nurses moved with remarkable tenderness from one infant to another. Dr. Mitchell stopped before one clear incubator and looked toward Nathan. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I would like you to meet your son." For several long seconds Nathan Carter could not move. The tiny infant resting beneath the warm glow of the incubator looked impossibly small, wrapped in a soft blanket with delicate fingers curled into loose fists. A transparent tube delivered gentle support, while quiet monitors traced a steady rhythm that filled the room with cautious hope. Nothing about the child resembled the boardrooms Nathan ruled or the towering office where every decision carried a price tag measured in millions of dollars. This fragile little life measured everything differently. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood beside him, allowing silence to do what words never could. Finally, Nathan stepped closer until he could see the faint rise and fall of the baby's chest. His reflection appeared in the clear wall of the incubator beside the infant's sleeping face, and for the first time in years he saw himself without the armor of success. He was simply a man standing before a child who might belong to him. "His name is Noah," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. Nathan blinked. "Emily named him already." The doctor nodded with a gentle smile. "She whispered it several times before she lost consciousness. She wanted to make sure we wrote it correctly." Nathan looked at the tiny identification card attached to the incubator. Noah Brooks. The last name struck him with unexpected force. Emily had not tried to claim his fortune. She had not placed the Carter name on the bracelet. She had simply given her son the only certainty she had left, her own name. "Can I ask something?" Nathan said. "Of course. Did Emily ever tell anyone I was the father before today?" Dr. Mitchell slowly shook her head. "Not that we know of. She kept her personal life remarkably private." Nathan lowered his gaze again. The questions only multiplied. Why had she stayed silent? Why had she faced pregnancy alone? Why had she waited until now to reach out? A nurse approached carrying a small chart before offering Nathan a warm smile. "Would you like to sanitize your hands?" she asked. Sometimes babies recognize familiar voices, even when they are sleeping. Nathan hesitated. "I have never even met him." "That does not mean your voice cannot become familiar today." He followed her instructions carefully, scrubbing his hands longer than necessary, as though he could somehow wash away 6 months of absence. The nurse opened a small access door in the incubator and nodded encouragingly. "You may gently place one finger in his hand if you would like." Nathan reached forward cautiously. His finger barely touched the baby's tiny palm before Noah's fingers instinctively closed around it. The grip was weak, almost feather-light, yet it felt stronger than every business contract Nathan had ever signed. He stopped breathing for a moment. The world outside the nursery disappeared. There were no stock markets, no luxury cars waiting outside, no skyscrapers bearing his family name. There was only a newborn child holding on to him without knowing who he was. Dr. Mitchell quietly watched the moment unfold before speaking again. "Babies have remarkable instincts." Nathan swallowed hard. He should be holding his mother's hand. "He will," she answered gently. "But tonight he is not alone." Nathan remained there for another minute, unable to break the tiny connection. Then Dr. Mitchell carefully handed him a clipboard. "There is one more matter we need to discuss." He looked down at the papers without releasing Noah's hand. "What is it?" "Emily's condition is stable, but she is still unconscious. Until she wakes, there are several medical decisions that may require authorization if circumstances change." Nathan frowned. Surely another family member can do that. The doctor's expression became unexpectedly solemn. "We searched her records. There are no emergency contacts besides you." Nathan slowly lifted his eyes. "No parents. Both passed away several years ago. Brothers? Sisters? None listed." The quiet room suddenly felt even larger. Emily had carried every burden alone, and he had never known. Dr. Mitchell took a careful breath before continuing. "Legally, we will continue providing every necessary treatment. However, if additional decisions become necessary overnight, you are the only person she trusted enough to place on that envelope." Nathan looked once more at the sleeping child, whose tiny hand still refused to let go. Somewhere beyond the nursery walls, Emily lay unconscious, unaware that the man she had trusted despite everything was finally standing only a few yards away. For the first time since entering the hospital, Nathan realized this night was not asking whether he believed the truth. It was asking whether he was willing to stay long enough to discover all of it. Nathan remained beside the incubator long after Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped away to give another family an update. The tiny pressure of Noah's fingers around his own had become the only thing anchoring him to the present. Every answer he thought he needed only created another question. Emily had never been careless. If she had carried this secret for months, she must have believed she had no other choice. A soft knock on the glass door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Mitchell returned carrying the small envelope that had been found in Emily's overnight bag. "I cannot give this to you yet," she said gently. "It is part of her personal belongings until she wakes. But I believe there is something inside that may help explain why she trusted you." Nathan looked at the sealed envelope through the clear evidence pouch. His own name appeared across the front in Emily's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters tightened something deep inside his chest. "When will she wake up?" he asked quietly. "We hope very soon, but everyone recovers differently. Right now she needs rest." Nathan nodded slowly. "Can I see her?" Dr. Mitchell studied him for a moment before leading him down another quiet hallway. The lights were dimmer here, the sound softer. They stopped outside a private recovery room. Through the partially open door, Nathan saw Emily resting peacefully beneath a light blanket. Her chest rose and fell with slow, even breaths. Strands of chestnut hair framed a face that looked thinner than he remembered, but there was still the same quiet grace that had first captured his attention years ago. He remained in the doorway, unable to step inside. Memories flooded back without permission. Sunday mornings drinking coffee on their apartment balcony. Long walks beside Lake Michigan after work. The day they promised that no promotion or deadline would ever become more important than their marriage. Somewhere along the journey, they had broken that promise together, one meeting and one missed conversation at a time. "She talked about you," Dr. Mitchell said softly. Nathan looked at her in surprise. "She did. Not often. But every time she mentioned your name, she never spoke with anger. That revelation hurt more than blame ever could. She should have hated me." "That is not what I heard." Silence settled between them before Nathan finally asked the question he had feared since arriving. "Did she know she was pregnant before the divorce was final?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated. "I think that is a conversation Emily deserves to have herself." Nathan accepted the answer. Deep down he already understood. Some truths belonged to the person who had lived through them. A nurse quietly entered the room to check Emily's chart before smiling kindly at Nathan. "She squeezed my hand yesterday when I told her everything would be all right," the nurse said. Even while she was exhausted, she whispered one sentence over and over. Nathan felt his heartbeat quicken. "What did she say?" The nurse looked at him with gentle eyes. "Please tell Nathan this was never his fault." The words landed with such unexpected force that Nathan had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. Never his fault. Not anger. Not accusation. Not regret. Forgiveness. He could not understand how she had found room in her heart for forgiveness when he had spent 6 months convincing himself that walking away had been the only solution. Dr. Mitchell quietly excused the nurse before turning back to Nathan. "There is a family consultation room down the hall if you need a moment." He shook his head. No, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I have already spent too many moments away." He stepped carefully into Emily's room for the first time. He did not touch her. He did not speak her name. He simply pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall over the city, washing the streets clean beneath the glow of thousands of lights. Inside the quiet hospital room, Nathan realized that the future he had spent 6 months trying to escape had quietly been waiting for him all along. And somewhere behind Emily's closed eyes rested a truth powerful enough to change everything he believed about the day their marriage had ended. Morning arrived quietly, carrying pale sunlight through the hospital window, as Nathan Carter realized he had never gone home. His tailored suit was wrinkled from spending the night in a chair beside Emily's bed, yet it was the most comfortable he had felt in months because, for the first time in a long while, he had stopped running from the past. Emily remained asleep, her breathing calm and steady, while somewhere down the hallway Noah continued his own determined fight toward a healthy future. A gentle knock broke the silence before Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered holding a tablet and a warm cup of coffee. "You should probably have this," she said with a small smile. Nathan accepted the cup with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." The doctor studied him for a moment. "Most people in your position would have gone back to work by now." Nathan looked through the window toward the city skyline. "Yesterday, I believed work was the most important thing in my life." He paused before continuing. "Today I am not so sure." Dr. Mitchell nodded as though she had heard similar words many times before. Hospitals have a way of changing priorities. She reviewed Emily's chart before looking back at him. "Her condition is improving. If everything continues this way, she may wake up later today. Relief washed across Nathan's face, but it lasted only a moment before another thought surfaced. When she wakes up, she is probably going to wonder why I am here. Perhaps, the doctor answered gently. Or perhaps she always believed you would come. Nathan lowered his eyes. He wished he possessed that same certainty. After finishing his coffee, he quietly walked back to the neonatal intensive care unit. The nurses greeted him with familiar smiles now. One of them invited him to sit beside Noah's incubator again. The tiny boy appeared more peaceful than the night before, his little chest rising with surprising determination. Nathan found himself speaking softly, almost without thinking. "Hello, Noah. I do not know if you can hear me yet, but I am here." The words felt awkward at first. Then they became easier. He spoke about the sunrise over Chicago, about the lake Emily always loved to visit in the spring, about the baseball games he once promised he would someday take his future children to see. He had not spoken those dreams aloud in years. A nurse quietly approached after several minutes. "His heart rate becomes steadier whenever you talk." Nathan looked up in surprise. "Really?" She nodded. Babies respond to calm voices more than people realize. He smiled faintly before continuing the quiet conversation, not because he believed Noah understood every word, but because speaking to him somehow repaired something inside himself that success never had. Later that afternoon, Olivia Bennett arrived carrying a neatly folded suit bag and Nathan's laptop. She stopped just inside the hallway, visibly surprised to find her employer sitting outside the nursery instead of issuing instructions from a penthouse office. "Sir," she said gently, "the board postponed the acquisition vote until next week. They asked whether you wanted me to bring the contracts." Nathan barely glanced at the expensive leather briefcase resting in her hands. "Leave them in the car." Olivia blinked. "Are you certain?" "Very." She hesitated before speaking again. "Everyone is worried about you." Nathan looked through the nursery window where Noah slept peacefully beneath the warm lights. "For years, everyone admired the wrong part of my life." Olivia followed his gaze toward the tiny infant. Her expression softened immediately. "He is beautiful." Nathan smiled for the first time since arriving at the hospital. It was small, almost uncertain, but completely genuine. "Yes," he whispered. "He really is." As Olivia quietly stepped away to give him privacy, Nathan remained standing beside the glass. He no longer wondered whether he belonged there. He only wondered how many precious moments had already slipped away before he even knew his son existed. Then, just as he rested his hand against the cool glass, a nurse hurried down the hallway with a hopeful smile. "Mr. Carter," she called softly, "Emily is opening her eyes." Emily's eyelids fluttered slowly before finally opening to the soft morning light filtering through the hospital window. Her eyes wandered across the unfamiliar ceiling before settling on the man sitting quietly beside her bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan Carter stood carefully, almost afraid that even the smallest movement might shatter the fragile silence between them. Emily blinked several times as though convincing herself she was not imagining him. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of her lips. "You came," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, rough from exhaustion. Nathan nodded gently. "I came as soon as they called." Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, relief washing over her face before she looked at him again. "I was not sure you would." Nathan pulled the chair a little closer, but kept a respectful distance. "Neither was I." The honesty surprised them both. Emily studied his face. The perfectly composed businessman she remembered had disappeared. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes after a sleepless night. For the first time in years, he looked less like a billionaire and more like the young man who had once stayed awake helping her study for graduate school exams. "Have you seen him?" she asked softly. Nathan smiled with a warmth that had been missing from his life for far too long. "Yes." Tears gathered instantly in Emily's eyes. "Is Noah all right?" "He is stronger than everyone expected." Nathan paused before continuing. "He has your determination." Emily let out a trembling breath she had been holding since she woke. "Thank God." Silence settled once more, but this time it carried comfort instead of distance. Nathan looked down at his hands before speaking again. "Why did you not tell me?" Emily did not answer immediately. She turned toward the window where rainwater still clung to the glass from the night before. "I wanted to." Nathan remained still, allowing her the space to continue. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I found out I was pregnant. She swallowed carefully. I spent 3 days trying to find the right words. Nathan listened without interrupting. I called your phone. Emily gave a faint, sad smile. The number had already been disconnected. Nathan frowned. I changed it after the divorce because too many clients had my personal number. Emily nodded gently. I know that now. She continued quietly. I sent letters to your office. I left messages with your executive assistant. I even asked your legal office whether they could forward one personal message. Nathan's expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. No one ever told me. Emily looked back at him with tired eyes that held no anger. After a while, I assumed that was your answer. Those words settled heavily between them. Nathan searched his memory. He remembered endless business trips, negotiations, and meetings that filled every hour after the divorce. He remembered believing complete silence from Emily meant she wanted the same clean break he did. Now that certainty began to crumble. Why did you never come to my house? He asked quietly. Emily smiled sadly. Because the last thing you said to me before we signed those papers was that we both deserved the chance to move forward. Nathan lowered his head. He remembered saying exactly that. At the time, he believed he was offering kindness. He had never imagined those words would become a wall she refused to cross. Emily slowly reached toward the bedside drawer and pulled out a small folded ultrasound picture that had been tucked inside her notebook. She held it carefully before handing it to him. I carried this with me every day. Nathan accepted the faded photograph with trembling fingers. Across the top was a date from nearly 6 months earlier. On the back, written in Emily's neat handwriting, were only 7 simple words. Someday I hope his father will know. Nathan stared at the note until his vision blurred. Every assumption he had built over the past 6 months quietly collapsed beneath the weight of those 7 words. And for the first time, he realized that the greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles, but in the truth that never reaches the person who needs to hear it. Emily rested for several minutes after Nathan finished reading the words on the back of the ultrasound picture. The room was filled only with the gentle hum of hospital equipment and the distant footsteps of nurses changing shifts. Nathan carefully folded the photograph and handed it back to her, as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever touched. I am so sorry, he said quietly. Emily accepted the picture and placed it beneath her pillow. I know you are. There was no bitterness in her voice. Somehow that hurt even more. Nathan pulled his chair closer. I need to know what happened after you tried to reach me. Emily looked toward the ceiling, gathering the strength to revisit months she had tried to survive one day at a time. At first I thought maybe you needed time. We had both been through so much. I told myself you would eventually return one of my messages. She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by her own hope. Every morning, I checked my phone before getting out of bed. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. There was never anything. Nothing. She continued softly. After 2 weeks, I stopped expecting your calls. After a month, I stopped listening for the mail truck. After 2 months, I convinced myself that silence was your decision. Nathan slowly shook his head. It was never my decision. Emily studied his face, searching for anything that resembled dishonesty. She found only regret. I believe you, she whispered. Nathan looked surprised. You do? If I thought you knew about Noah and chose to abandon him, I would never have written your name on that envelope. Her words settled deeply inside him. She had trusted the man she believed he truly was, not the distance that had grown between them. Nathan leaned forward. Who answered your calls at my office? Emily frowned as she tried to remember. Usually a woman. She always said you were unavailable. The last time she told me not to contact you again because you had moved on with your life. Nathan felt every muscle in his body tighten. Did she give her name? Emily nodded slowly. I think it was Vanessa. The name struck him immediately. Vanessa Cole had served as his executive assistant until shortly after the divorce before accepting another position within the company. She had controlled his schedule, screened his personal messages, and managed nearly every piece of communication that reached his office. Nathan replayed countless months in his mind. There had been days when Vanessa mentioned clearing unwanted messages before they reached him. At the time, he appreciated her efficiency. Now, every memory carried a different meaning. Before he could speak, Olivia Bennett knocked gently on the partially open door. I am sorry to interrupt, she said carefully. There is something you should probably see. Nathan stepped into the hallway where Olivia quietly handed him a tablet. After what Emily told you yesterday, I asked the Information Technology Department to recover archived communication logs from your executive office. They worked through the night. Nathan looked at the screen. A list of incoming phone records appeared one beneath another. His breathing slowed as he recognized Emily's number repeating over and over across several weeks. 32 calls. None had ever been forwarded to him. Olivia opened another folder. Scanned letters. Voicemail notifications. Delivery confirmations. Every message marked as resolved without reaching his desk. Nathan stared at the records in stunned silence. Who authorized this? He finally asked. Olivia lowered her voice. Every deletion required executive assistant approval. Nathan's hands trembled slightly as he continued scrolling through the files. Emily had never disappeared from his life. She had been trying desperately to reach him, while someone else quietly erased every path leading back to him. He looked through the glass toward Emily's room where she rested peacefully, unaware of what had just been uncovered. The painful mystery that had haunted both of them for 6 months was no longer a misunderstanding. It had become something far more deliberate, and for the first time Nathan realized that the truth separating their broken family had been hidden in plain sight all along. The hospital corridor suddenly felt too narrow for the weight Nathan Carter carried as he walked away from Emily's room with the communication records still open on his tablet. Every deleted voicemail, every intercepted letter, every unanswered attempt reached him now months too late. He had spent half a year believing Emily chose silence, while she had spent the same months believing he had chosen to ignore her. Olivia Bennett caught up with him outside the family lounge. The information technology director is waiting on a secure call, she said quietly. They recovered one more archive. Nathan followed her into the empty room where a laptop had already been opened. The director appeared on the screen with a troubled expression. Mr. Carter, I wish we had discovered this sooner. Nathan remained standing. Tell me everything. The director pulled up a timeline showing internal email activity. Several personal messages addressed to you were manually removed before they entered your executive inbox. That required administrative privileges. Nathan already knew the answer before asking. Vanessa Cole? Yes, sir. The director hesitated before continuing. There is also an internal note attached to one of the deleted messages. He enlarged the document on the screen. Nathan read the sentence once. Then again. Miss Brooks continues attempting personal contact. Per previous handling instructions, all communication has been closed without notification to Mr. Carter. Nathan felt the room fall silent around him. Handling instructions? He asked. What does that even mean? We cannot determine her motive, the director answered. But every action originated from Vanessa's account. Nathan thanked him and ended the call. Olivia remained still, giving him space. After several moments, she spoke carefully. Vanessa resigned 3 months ago. She accepted a position with another investment group in Denver. Nathan slowly shook his head. No, Olivia looked confused. Sir, someone who goes to this much effort does not simply disappear without believing nobody will ever uncover it. Before either of them could continue, Nathan's phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar Colorado number. He answered cautiously. Nathan Carter speaking. A woman's voice, hesitant and unsteady, came through the speaker. Mr. Carter, this is Vanessa. Nathan's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. I was wondering when you would call. A long silence followed before she finally spoke again. I heard you went to Mercy General Hospital. You heard correctly. Another pause. Then you know. I know Emily tried to reach me dozens of times. Vanessa took a slow breath. I never imagined things would go this far. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Then explain it to me. Her voice trembled with regret. After the divorce, you stopped sleeping. You worked every weekend. You barely smiled anymore. You kept telling everyone you needed a clean break to rebuild your life. Nathan remained silent. When Emily called the first time, I thought answering would only pull you backward. That was not your decision to make. I know. Tears were audible in her voice now. Then she kept calling. Every message sounded more desperate. I convinced myself she was trying to change your mind. I thought protecting you meant keeping the past away. Nathan's grip tightened around the phone. She was carrying my child. I did not know that at first, Vanessa whispered. When I finally realized, I was ashamed. By then so much time had passed that I did not know how to admit what I had done. Nathan leaned against the window overlooking the city. You stole 6 months from my son. Vanessa began crying quietly. I know. I have regretted it every single day. Nathan looked through the glass toward the nursery where Noah rested only a few floors away. Anger rose inside him, but it faded almost as quickly as it came. No amount of anger could return the moments that had already been lost. You should have trusted me to make my own choices, he said softly. Instead, you made them for all 3 of us. Vanessa whispered, I am sorry, before the line went silent. Nathan lowered the phone without another word. Olivia stepped beside him. What are you going to do? Nathan looked back toward Emily's room, where forgiveness had somehow survived months of silence, and then toward the nursery where a tiny boy waited for a future he deserved. Right now, he answered quietly, I am going to stop wasting another single minute. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm Nathan Carter had never imagined for himself. Every morning began before sunrise, not with financial reports waiting on his desk, but with the familiar walk through the softly lit halls of Mercy General Hospital. Nurses who had once greeted him with polite curiosity now welcomed him by name, smiling as though he had always belonged there. He spent the first hour of every visit beside Noah's incubator, speaking softly about ordinary things that suddenly felt more valuable than quarterly earnings. He described the sunrise over Lake Michigan, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through downtown Chicago, and the tiny apartment where he and Emily had once dreamed about raising a family long before success complicated everything. Noah never answered with words, yet each day his tiny fingers wrapped around Nathan's hand with a little more strength. One afternoon, a neonatal nurse approached, carrying a small notebook. Many parents keep a journal for babies born early, she explained. When Noah is older, he will know someone was here every day. Nathan accepted the notebook carefully. The first page remained blank for several minutes before he finally wrote, Day 1 together. I am late, but I promise I will not leave again. He closed the cover with unexpected emotion, realizing those words were not only for Noah, but also for himself. Emily watched these quiet changes from her recovery room whenever the nurses shared updates. She still tired easily, but every report about Nathan staying long after visiting hours ended slowly chipped away at the doubts she had carried for months. One evening, Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered Emily's room carrying a gentle smile. Someone would like permission to try something new. Emily looked confused. Who? Nathan. The doctor laughed softly. He has spent the last 20 minutes learning how to prepare a feeding syringe under supervision. He insisted that if Noah can accept nourishment from the nurses, he should also learn how to help. Emily blinked in surprise. The Nathan she remembered rarely had enough free time to eat lunch before another meeting interrupted his day. He is doing that. Dr. Mitchell nodded. Very carefully. Emily smiled through quiet tears. He always said he was terrible with babies. Everyone is terrible until they begin, the doctor replied kindly. Down the hall, Nathan stood beside a neonatal nurse, following every instruction with complete concentration. He washed his hands exactly as instructed, checked every measurement twice, and asked more questions than any new parent the staff could remember. When the nurse complimented his patience, Nathan smiled sheepishly. Negotiating billion-dollar contracts was easier than this. The nurse laughed. That is because contracts do not depend on your heart. Nathan glanced through the incubator at Noah, whose tiny eyes fluttered open for a brief moment before closing again. He deserves my whole heart, he answered quietly. Later that evening, Emily felt strong enough to visit the nursery in a wheelchair. A nurse carefully guided her inside while Nathan remained unaware, completely focused on Noah. He was softly reading a children's storybook one of the volunteers had donated to the hospital library. His voice rose and fell gently with every page, completely unconcerned that the only audience was a newborn too small to understand the words. Emily stopped several feet away, simply watching. She remembered countless nights during their marriage when she wished Nathan would leave work early just once so they could eat dinner together. Now he sat patiently reading about friendly bears and bright blue trains without glancing at a single business notification. The transformation seemed almost impossible. Nathan finally looked up and noticed Emily smiling at him from the doorway. Embarrassed, he closed the book halfway. I thought it might help him recognize my voice. Emily shook her head gently. I think it is helping someone else recognize who you have always been. Nathan lowered the book slowly. I should have been here from the beginning. Emily wheeled herself a little closer until they both stood beside Noah together. You cannot change yesterday, she said softly. But every hour you spend here changes tomorrow. Nathan looked down at his son sleeping peacefully between them, and for the first time since entering the hospital he understood that becoming a father was not a single moment marked on a birth certificate. It was a choice made again and again through patience, presence, and love, one ordinary day at a time. 3 more days passed, and the hospital slowly transformed from a place of uncertainty into a place filled with cautious hope. Noah gained a few precious ounces, enough for every nurse on the neonatal floor to celebrate, as though he had won a marathon. Emily grew stronger with each passing morning, taking short walks through the hallway with the help of a physical therapist before always ending her exercise beside the nursery window. Nathan never missed a single visit. His office had become something he managed through phone calls and brief video meetings while his heart remained inside Mercy General Hospital. Late one afternoon, as golden sunlight stretched across the polished floor, Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached them with encouraging news. If Noah continues improving like this, we may begin preparing for his discharge within the next couple of weeks. Emily smiled through grateful tears. Nathan instinctively reached for her hand before realizing what he had done. Neither of them pulled away. They simply stood together looking through the glass at the tiny boy whose quiet determination had already changed both of their lives. Later that evening, Emily sat beside the nursery, reading one of the children's books Nathan had brought. When she finished the last page, she closed the cover gently and looked toward him. Can I ask you something? Nathan nodded. Anything. Why are you trying so hard? He looked surprised by the question. Because I lost 6 months I can never get back. Emily slowly shook her head. No. I mean now. You have already apologized. You know the truth. You could hire the best nannies, the best doctors, the best lawyers. You could solve everything with money. Nathan smiled sadly. Money cannot read bedtime stories. Emily remained silent. Money cannot teach Noah how to ride a bicycle. His voice softened. Money cannot make him believe his father wanted him from the very beginning. Emily lowered her eyes. You do not owe me anything anymore, Nathan. He answered almost immediately. Maybe not, but I owe him everything. Before Emily could respond, a nurse hurried toward them carrying a cordless phone. Mr. Carter, your office says it is urgent. Nathan accepted the phone and listened quietly for nearly a minute. Finally, he thanked the caller and ended the conversation. Emily noticed the conflict in his expression. What happened? Nathan exhaled slowly. The acquisition vote has been moved to tomorrow morning. Every board member will be there. Investors flew in from 3 states. They are expecting me to lead the meeting in person. Emily understood immediately. Deals of that size shaped companies for years. You should go. Nathan looked through the nursery window where Noah slept peacefully beneath the warm lights. Tomorrow morning? Emily nodded. The company needs its chief executive. Nathan smiled faintly. My company survived before I arrived today. Noah has never had his father before. Emily searched his face, trying to determine whether he truly meant those words. Nathan, I do not want you sacrificing your career because of guilt. He looked at her with quiet sincerity. This is not guilt. He turned his attention back toward the nursery. It is perspective. At sunrise the following morning, Nathan sat beside Noah, instead of inside the boardroom where billion-dollar decisions waited without him. He quietly read another story while a nurse adjusted the blankets around the sleeping infant. His phone vibrated several times with incoming calls from directors and investors, but he silenced every notification without checking a single message. A few minutes later, Olivia Bennett appeared in the nursery carrying a folder. The board voted without you, she said. Nathan looked up calmly. How did it go? Olivia smiled. They postponed the acquisition indefinitely. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Because I was not there? She nodded. One of the directors told everyone something I never expected to hear. Nathan waited. Olivia's smile grew warmer. He said if the man who never missed a meeting chose to stay beside his newborn son instead, then perhaps that was the most important investment any of them should respect. Nathan looked back at Noah, whose tiny hand had once again wrapped around his finger, and for the first time in his life he realized that missing the biggest meeting of his career did not feel like losing anything at all. Another week passed, and the tiny celebrations became larger than anyone had expected. Noah no longer needed as much medical support as before, and every improvement, no matter how small, felt like a miracle earned one patient day at a time. The nurses proudly updated the whiteboard outside the nursery with each new milestone, and Nathan Carter found himself stopping to read it every morning as though it were the most important report he had ever received. Emily's strength returned little by little as well. She could now walk through the hallway without assistance, and every afternoon she and Nathan stood side by side outside Noah's room, talking less about the past and more about the future. They still carried the scars of everything that had happened, but those wounds no longer controlled every conversation. One afternoon, Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the nursery carrying an encouraging smile. "I think someone is ready for something special today." Nathan looked up from the rocking chair where he had been quietly reading another children's story. "What do you mean?" The doctor nodded toward Noah. "His vital signs have remained remarkably stable all morning. I believe it is finally time for skin-to-skin contact with both parents." Nathan's eyes widened with surprise. Emily covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The nurses carefully prepared the room while explaining every step with gentle patience. Emily was the first to hold Noah against her chest, closing her eyes as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. The tiny infant settled almost immediately, his breathing calm and peaceful as though he already recognized the heartbeat that had comforted him before he was born. After several minutes, one of the nurses smiled at Nathan. "Your turn, Dad." He froze for only a moment before carefully sitting in the chair they had prepared. The nurse gently placed Noah against his chest beneath a soft blanket. Nathan instinctively wrapped one arm around the tiny boy, afraid to move even an inch. Noah stirred softly before relaxing completely. The room became perfectly still. Emily watched from across the room, unable to look away. She had seen Nathan negotiate with world leaders, speak before thousands of investors, and command every room he entered. Yet she had never seen him look as humbled as he did holding their son. Nathan lowered his head until his forehead nearly touched Noah's tiny cap. "Hello again, little man," he whispered. "I have been waiting to meet you properly." The nurse quietly dimmed the lights and stepped back with the rest of the staff, allowing the family a few private moments. Minutes passed without anyone speaking. Then something unexpected happened. Noah slowly opened his eyes, blinked several times, and lifted one tiny hand toward Nathan's chin. His fingers brushed lightly against the stubble on Nathan's face before curling gently around one of his shirt buttons. Emily laughed softly through her tears. "I think he likes you." Nathan smiled with quiet disbelief. "I think I am the lucky one." Dr. Mitchell stood near the doorway watching the moment unfold. "Babies remember comfort," she said gently. "Sometimes they simply need time to discover where it comes from." Nathan looked at Emily across the room. "I cannot change the months I missed." Emily met his eyes. "No." He tightened the blanket around Noah just enough to keep him warm. "But I can spend the rest of my life making sure he never doubts that I am here." Emily nodded slowly. She believed him now, not because of promises, but because she had watched him choose this hospital every single day over boardrooms, headlines, and wealth. Love had stopped being something he spoke about. It had become something he practiced. As the afternoon sunlight poured gently through the nursery windows, Noah made a tiny, contented sound before settling peacefully against Nathan's heartbeat, and every nurse in the room quietly smiled because they all understood they were witnessing something far greater than a medical milestone. They were watching a father finally arrive exactly where he had always belonged. 2 weeks later, the day everyone had quietly hoped for finally arrived. Noah had grown stronger with every feeding, every peaceful night, and every ounce gained beneath the careful eyes of the neonatal team. A colorful paper star now hung above his crib with the words "Ready to go home" written across it in cheerful blue letters. Nurses who had cared for him since his first day stopped by one after another, each wanting a final moment with the little boy who had reminded them that quiet determination could sometimes be stronger than fear. Emily carefully folded Noah's tiny blankets into the diaper bag, while Nathan checked the infant car seat for what felt like the 10th time. He reread every safety instruction until one of the nurses laughed gently. "Mr. Carter, I promise he is going to be all right." Nathan smiled sheepishly. "I negotiate complicated business contracts for a living." The nurse grinned. "And today your biggest responsibility is making sure those straps are snug. Emily watched the exchange with a smile she had not worn in a very long time. The heaviness that had surrounded both of them for months had begun to lift, replaced by something quieter and infinitely more valuable. Before leaving, Dr. Sarah Mitchell gathered them together near the nursery entrance. "You both have done remarkably well," she said warmly. "Noah still has follow-up appointments ahead, but he has every reason to thrive." Nathan reached out and shook her hand. "There is no way to thank you enough." She smiled kindly. "The best way to thank us is simple. Love him well." Nathan glanced toward Emily before answering. "We will." A short time later, they stepped outside the hospital together for the first time as a family. The spring air carried the scent of fresh rain, and sunlight reflected across the wet sidewalks of Chicago. Nathan carefully secured Noah inside the waiting car before quietly closing the door. He stood there for a moment looking through the window at his sleeping son. Emily walked beside him. "You look nervous." He laughed softly. Inside the hospital there were experts everywhere. And outside it is just us. Emily gently touched his arm. "That is enough." The drive home was peaceful. Nathan had postponed every meeting again, ignoring several congratulatory messages from business associates who had somehow learned Noah had been discharged. For the first time in years, he did not feel guilty for being unavailable. Every traffic light simply gave him another excuse to glance into the rearview mirror and make sure Noah was still sleeping comfortably. Instead of driving toward the penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago, Nathan turned into a quiet neighborhood lined with mature oak trees. Emily looked at him with surprise. "This is not your apartment." "No," he answered. "It is not." He parked beside a modest white house with a wraparound porch and a small maple tree in the front yard. Emily looked at him in confusion. "Whose house is this?" Nathan smiled gently. "Do you remember the place we almost bought when we were first married?" Emily stared through the windshield. She recognized it immediately. Years earlier, they had dreamed about raising children there, but Nathan's expanding career and endless travel had convinced them to choose a luxury condominium closer to his office instead. "You bought it?" she whispered. Nathan nodded. 3 days after Noah was born. Emily looked at him with astonishment. "Why?" He opened the passenger door before answering. "Because I finally understood something." She waited quietly. Nathan looked toward the front porch where a simple wooden swing moved gently in the breeze. A home is not measured by how high above the city it stands. It is measured by how safe the people inside feel. Emily felt tears gather once again. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of taking out a velvet ring box, he unfolded a single handwritten page. "I am not asking you to make any promises today," he said softly. "I am only asking for one chance to earn your trust again, one ordinary day at a time. Whether it takes months or years, Noah deserves parents who never stop choosing him, and I hope that someday you might choose me again as well." Emily looked from the letter to the sleeping baby in the car, then back to the man standing before her. She did not answer with words. Instead, she stepped beside him, slipped her hand gently into his, and together they carried Noah toward the front door of the house, where hope had quietly been waiting for them all along. 2 years later, the little white house had become everything Nathan Carter and Emily Brooks once dreamed it could be. The maple tree in the front yard was taller, the porch swing had become Noah's favorite place to watch summer rain, and the walls that had once echoed with silence now carried the sounds of bedtime stories, laughter, and tiny footsteps racing across polished wooden floors. Their journey back to one another had not happened overnight. Trust had returned through thousands of ordinary moments rather than one grand gesture. Nathan kept every promise he had made. He learned how to braid toy train tracks across the living room floor, how to calm fevers in the middle of the night, how to pack preschool lunches that somehow always included too many apple slices because Noah loved them. Emily watched quietly as the man who once measured success in contracts and headlines slowly began measuring it in bedtime hugs and Saturday mornings together. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nathan received an invitation to speak at one of the largest business leadership conferences in the country. The event promised worldwide media coverage and honored executives who had transformed modern industry. His acceptance speech had already been drafted by the communications department weeks in advance. The conference date, however, landed on the same morning as Noah's very first preschool graduation ceremony. Olivia Bennett walked into Nathan's office carrying both schedules. "Sir," she said gently, "there is still time to move the school event to another family member if necessary." Nathan looked at the framed photograph on his desk instead. It showed Emily laughing while Noah sat proudly on his shoulders during their first family trip to the lake. He smiled before quietly picking up his pen. With one signature, he declined the conference invitation. Olivia blinked. "The organizers are expecting you." Nathan nodded. "So is my son." On the morning of the ceremony, rows of folding chairs filled the school auditorium while parents held cameras and wiped away happy tears. Noah stood with his classmates wearing a tiny blue graduation cap that looked slightly too large for his head. He searched the audience until his bright eyes found Nathan and Emily sitting together in the front row. His face immediately lit up with the biggest smile in the room. When the children finished singing their final song, the teacher invited each family to take photographs. Noah ran straight toward Nathan, wrapped both little arms around his father's legs, and looked up proudly. "Daddy, did you see me?" Nathan knelt until they were eye level. "Buddy, I would not have missed that for anything in the world." Emily quietly captured the moment with her phone, remembering a time when she feared Noah might grow up wondering whether his father wanted him. Looking at them now, that fear felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Later that evening, the three of them sat together on the porch swing, watching the sun disappear behind the maple tree. Noah rested against Nathan's shoulder, already half asleep after an exciting day. Emily slipped her hand into Nathan's, the same quiet gesture that had begun outside the hospital months before. "Do you ever miss the life you had?" she asked softly. Nathan looked toward the sleeping little boy in his arms before answering. "I still lead a company." He smiled gently. "But this family leads me." A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the yard as the porch light flickered on above them. Nathan thought back to the phone call that had once shattered every certainty he possessed. At the time, it had sounded like the worst day of his life. Now he understood it had been the beginning of the best one. People often believed wealth could buy anything. Nathan had once believed that too. But the greatest gift he ever received came from a fragile newborn who wrapped tiny fingers around his hand, a woman who chose forgiveness over bitterness, and the quiet realization that true success is never measured by the size of an empire. It is measured by the people waiting for you when you come home. And sometimes the richest man in the room is simply the father who never misses another bedtime story.